Hello everybody and welcome back. We are now on to, I want to say the 12th video, which is rather apt insofar as it's going to be covering the Second Amendment. It's mostly apt because of the recent events that have taken place in Connecticut and the sudden outcry for a ban on weapons and all that crap that generally gets thrown out the minute anything that happens to relate with a firearm and is negative happens to bring about, because everybody knows emotion makes everyone make good decisions. That is, of course, sarcasm. If you didn't catch that, you were either a liberal or stupid, but I repeat myself. So let's just get right into it then, shall we? The next well-known and often misunderstood portion of the Bill of Rights is the Second Amendment. In full, it reads as follows, quote, "A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed." End quote. Now, like every other term of art discussed thus far, this phraseology has a history behind it. As previously explained, Madison was one of the main architects of the Bill of Rights, and when compiling the language for what is now the Second Amendment, he originally worded it in a different manner. The clauses were in reverse order, and immediately thereafter was a provision made to exempt the religiously scrupulous from having to render military service in times of need. After some revisions by several congressional committees, the scrupulosity clause was struck out as unnecessary, and the amendment was finally reworded into its present form. This can be confirmed by looking at the Annals of Congress, specifically as concerns the year 1789. What weighed on the minds of the founders was the actual intent of the proposed amendment. Again, one must note that the text of the amendment is rooted in Blexton, specifically Volume 1, pages 139 to 141, as I have in the edition that I'm using, and that the debates surrounding it are invaluable to understanding its underlying meaning. One should first focus on the amendment's independent clause, paying special attention to the term of art contained therein, to keep and bear arms. Referring to the nature of the Second Amendment itself, one should note that it, and 9 other amendments, is part of a Bill of Rights. Now, as Walter Burns commented, quote, "A human right, properly and originally understood, derives from or reflects an aspect of human nature, an aspect that distinguishes human from all other classes of beings and makes it possible for them alone to have rights. Man is not unique in having desires. For example, man and all other animals have planted in them a strong desire for self-preservation. But only in man's case does this desire for preservation become transformed into a right to take and use what is necessary or useful to his being. It's man's rationality that distinguishes him from other animals and allows him to be endowed with rights." End quote. Now, that is, rights are only granted to individual persons, and this applies in Blacksonian terms to persons either natural or artificial. That's kind of a minor distinction that really doesn't need a whole lot of clarification. In this case, we're mostly focusing on individual persons, but still, if there's any clarification needed, people can write me and I'll go into it, but it's not really necessary. But again, these rights are granted to individual persons and never refer to governments. Ever. Thus, the right of the people to keep and bear arms concerns individual citizens. The structures of the other surrounding amendments in the Bill of Rights also affirm this. Namely, this pertains to Amendments 1, 4, 9, and especially 10, where states are explicitly differentiated from the people. All 4 of these make reference to the people, and in every one of these amendments it is clear that individuals are the ones being protected. It does not seem at all likely that those who crafted the Bill of Rights would use such terminology unequivocally in all the other amendments therein, and then suddenly use it in a completely different sense for only one of them. Aside from the structural arguments in favor of this particular interpretation, there is a more concrete argument from the historical precedent that lends credence to it as well. To start, it is important to reiterate that the founders, for the most part, used words, phrases, and other terminology intimately familiar to themselves and the states. The federal Constitution was thus crafted with language which would be instantly recognizable to anyone in the late 1700s. For instance, various state constitutions of that era already had provisions concerning arms and militia. Though some examples I'm going to give are from, respectively, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts, North Carolina, and then especially the great Old Dominion Virginia herself. The one from Pennsylvania, it says, quote, that the people have a right to bear arms for the defense of themselves and the state, and as standing armies in the time of peace are dangerous to liberty, they ought not to be kept up, and that the military should be kept under strict subordination to and governed by the civil power, end quote. For Massachusetts, end quote, quote, the people have a right to keep and to bear arms for the common defense, end quote. North Carolina, quote, the people have a right to bear arms for the defense of the state, and as standing armies in time of peace are dangerous to liberty, they ought not to be kept up, and that the military should be kept under strict subordination to and governed by the civil power, end quote. And the most revealing is the text of the Constitution of Virginia, which, again, we should remember that Madison, the main author of the Second Amendment, came from, which states, quote, that a well-regulated militia composed of the body of the people, trained to arms, is the proper, natural, and safe defense of a free state, that standing armies in times of peace should be avoided as dangerous to liberty, and that in all cases the military should be under strict subordination to and governed by the civil power, end quote. By this point, it's rather well established that the right to keep and bear arms was a protected right of the people, i.e., individuals. Still, one must also understand just why the Second Amendment protects the right to keep and bear arms. The words would be immediately superfluous if they had exactly the same meaning. So, what exactly is the difference between keeping and bearing arms? Historian extraordinaire Don B. Cates, Jr. explained the following in his book. I'm sorry, it wasn't a book. It was in the Michigan Law Review. It was back in 1983. He said, quote, the word that the amendment uses to guarantee the right to possess arms is keep. Bear being used only to denote carrying them outside the home. Obviously, even if a negative pregnant as to the possession could have been inferred had the amendment used bear arms alone, that inference disappears completely when to keep is added. That is, it is one thing to possess or own a firearm. It is quite another to carry them for the purpose of using them, as necessary, of course. That much even logic dictates. That's fine. The last major term of art to be examined is that which was postponed much earlier, militia, and perhaps its modifier, well-regulated. But this term, while controversial in modern times, has a very simple meaning, and had such a very simple meaning in the late 18th century. According to the Encyclopedia of the American Constitution, of which Leonard W. Levy and several others were the editors, this was from page 1639, quote, it is necessary to remember that in the 18th century the militia was coextensive with the adult male citizenry. By colonial law, every household was required to possess arms, and every male of military age was required to muster during military emergencies bearing his own arms. This amendment, in guaranteeing the arms of each citizen, simultaneously guaranteed arms for the militia. That is, it says the militia being necessary for the existence of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. By saying that everyone should be able to keep their own guns and use them as necessary, they're more or less also covering their bases in terms of the militia, because it's more or less the same thing. Saying, yes, individuals may keep and bear guns because at any moment they may be called by their respective states to execute the laws of the Union or the states respectively. That is, to guarantee rights to the individuals is to guarantee guns to the militia. Therefore, the militia referred to in this amendment is nothing more than all able-bodied male citizens, and this is to cite Don B. Cates, Jr. again. This assertion that I'm about to make is further substantiated by the Militia Act of 1792, passed by Congress shortly after the adoption of the Second Amendment, and is also currently effective, and also refers to the currently effective Militia Act, which also has its roots in the same traditional understanding of the terminology. But again, the militia referred to in this amendment is nothing more than all able-bodied male citizens, quote, between the age of majority, usually 16 to 18, and a designated cutoff age, usually between 45 and 60. End quote. It is an informal, or as some would say, unorganized, body of men of the aforementioned characteristics who in times of crisis may be summoned for formal training that they might become a more effective fighting force. Now this also keeps in touch with Hamilton's notion of the militia as expressed in Federalist number 29, where he says, quote, "The project of disciplining all the militia of the United States is as futile as it would be injurious if it were capable of being carried into execution. A tolerable expertness in military movements is a business that requires time and practice. It is not a day or even a week that will suffice for the attainment of it. To oblige the great body of the yeomanry," that is, the common people, "and of the other classes of the citizens to be under arms for the purpose of going through military exercises and evolutions as often as might be necessary, to acquire the degree of perfection which would entitle them the character of a well-regulated militia, would be a real grievance to the people and a serious public inconvenience and loss." End quote. Now, through and through, the definition of the militia, as understood in the Founders' Day, is not at all like the National Guard interpretation that many modern scholars tend to attribute to it. One of the few things left to do now, then, to grasp fully what a is to find out exactly what a well-regulated militia entails. Now, this is relatively easy, given Hamilton's commentary from Federalist number 29, which I just read, and the previously invoked excerpt from the Virginia State Constitution. Now, it implies simply that the militia, in time of need, may be appropriately disciplined and trained. This also helps to explain how the two clauses of Amendment 2 weave together. Don B. Cates, Jr. explained again as follows, quote, "One purpose of the founders having been to guarantee the arms of the militia, they accomplished that purpose by guaranteeing the arms of the individuals who made up the militia. In this respect, it would have never occurred to the founders to differentiate between the arms of the two groups in the context of the amendment's language. The personally owned arms of the individual were the arms of the militia. Thus, the amendment's wording, so opaque to us, made perfect sense to the framers, believing that a militia, composed of the entire people possessed of their individually owned arms, was necessary for the protection of a free state. They guaranteed the people's right to possess those arms." End quote. Now, that is, the framers knew very well that if all the militia were to be trained for service in emergencies, they would need the proper equipment and such to do so. Now, therefore, also inherent in the right to keep and bear arms is also the right to own those things which are necessary for them to work, such as gunpowder and bullets. So that way you can't have that really cutesy end around that some people try and give me when I explain this. They're like, well, you can keep and bear arms, but you're not guaranteed the right to bullets and gunpowder. I'm like, okay, so let me put it this way. You're allowed to own a car, but you can't put gas in it. This overall examination of Amendment 2 ties in to the use of the term militia as used in Article 1, Section 8, where it necessarily means the same thing. For instance, when the word militia is used in Article 1, the phraseology is, again, as such, Congress shall have the power, quote, to provide for calling forth the militia to execute the laws of the Union, and to provide for organizing, arming, and disciplining the militia, and for governing such part of them as may be employed in the service of the United States. End quote. There is one small detail that shows the use of militia to be identical to its use in Amendment 2. The definite article preceding it, that is, the word "the." This strongly suggests that the militia mentioned already exists. This directly contrasts with Congress' other powers, such as to raise and support armies, or to support and maintain a navy. In those instances, it seems that Congress is given power to create those entities already mentioned, whereas the existence of the militia, defined as all able-bodied male citizens of military age, and is not the select or organized militia, is presupposed. Thus, the term militia is used in the same sense in Article 1 as it is in Section 2. As it is in Amendment 2. However, as was the case with Amendment 1, the right to keep and bear arms is not absolute. After all, it was meant to be a safeguard for individuals and society's welfare. Now, Levy's encyclopedia explained this aptly, saying that, quote, "The ownership of firearms by minors, felons, and the mentally impaired, and the carrying of them outside the home by anyone, may be limited or banned. Moreover, the government may limit the types of arms that may be kept. There is no right, for example, to own artillery or automatic weapons or the weapons of the footpad and gangster, such as sawed-off shotguns and blackjacks. Gun controls in the form of registration and licensing requirements are also permissible as long as the ordinary citizen's right to possess arms for home protection is respected." Now, end quote. And again, this cannot be emphasized enough. When it is said that the government may limit the types of arms that may be kept, this refers solely to those locations under direct federal jurisdiction. The states can restrict gun use and ownership as they wish, but even then, that power is tempered by what the general ideology of the state's respective electorates will permit. With this history and terminology fully fleshed out, we may now spell out the definition of Amendment 2 in more contemporary terms. And this, again, is me summarizing, but this is what I would interpret it as so that most people can understand it today. Amendment 2 means, quote, "A body of the people, appropriately disciplined and trained to arms, being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the individual to possess and carry arms shall not be infringed, although it may be regulated under certain very specific conditions." Now, end quote. Now, this amendment, pregnant with power, cannot possibly be summed up accurately in so few words, mostly because of that very last part I had to tack on there, that it may be regulated under certain very specific conditions. No one wants to sit here and go through time after time after time for hours on end trying to figure out exactly what those conditions are. So, the one that I've provided here should serve as a general guide and summary of what has been studied thus far. If you are interested in further delving into the history of this text, I highly recommend Stephen P. Halbrook's book, That Every Man Be Armed, The Evolution of a Constitutional Right, paying special attention to chapters 2 and especially 3. And that, more or less, wraps up the Second Amendment. Bit of a nail-biter, but when you really crack down and study it, it makes a whole lot more sense. So with that, I suppose we're done for this time, and we can pick up next time with a more, even I would argue, possibly even more intense study of another term of art, this one being those that are contained in Amendment 5, and the first of which, probably the only one that we'll study next time, will be the infamous Due Process Clause. Ooh. So until then, I think we can let you go with, and hopefully what I've done thus far can also put in perspective the actual argument and concerning firearms, and because nowadays, especially after the whole shooting incident in Connecticut, hopefully this puts in perspective the battle being waged between the NRA and other gun rights people and the liberals in government. In some respects, I guess you could say they both have an argument, insofar as, yes, the NRA is right insofar as we do have a right to own guns. That much is incontestable, as I've more or less shown. However, in this respect, the liberals are only right accidentally or tangentially. They just don't believe anyone should have guns, period. That's one thing. Well, except for, the military or whatever. But while they are right in the sense that it is possible for the state and constitutional for them to regulate the ownership of guns. But again, the powers of Congress are limited insofar as they only apply to those areas directly under their jurisdiction, that is, under federal jurisdiction. So they can't ban weapons for everybody in every state because constitutionally, again, that's up to the states to decide. A state theoretically could ban guns, but I'm going to guess that by and large, the people of that state that, woe to it, that would decide to try that, I'm rather hesitant to think that they would just take that lying down. I'm more or less going to say that they would probably say, sure, take my guns as long as it's barrel end first. But, so, with that, I think I can let you go until next time. Just a little something to ponder. And so until then, good night, God bless, and take care. All right, bye-bye.